First off, I just want to thank everyone here for your passion and for being here and for what you do. We could not do this without you. So I'm here to talk about Anne Arundel County. It's a little different from Howard County. I'm in the Cultural Resources Division. I am one of 3 people that work in that division, which is located in the Office of Planning and Zoning. I'm the archaeological sites planner. I also work with an architectural historian, and we also have a supervisor, Jane Cox, who oversees our division of 3 people. We are lucky enough to have a consultant pool, so we do have a few consultants who help us with compliance site visits and public outreach and public programming. So what we do is basically first compliance review and mitigation of development through Article 17 of our county code. So we review development plans to make sure they aren't impacting cultural resources. We also maintain an inventory and do research, survey, and documentation for archaeological sites, cemeteries, historic buildings, and scenic and historic roads. So we have actually quite a few cemeteries on our inventory. So when people ask me what we do, what cultural resources is, I say it's archaeological sites, scenic and historic roads, historic buildings, and cemeteries. Because I had no idea when I started my job that cemeteries was going to be the #1 thing I do. I'm an archaeologist, and I had no idea how many cemeteries that we would be having to address every single day. I have a to-do list every day that always gets changed because every day I get a phone call about a cemetery, or 3, or 4, or 5. It is a constant conversation. So a lot of what we do, it's hard to get a lot of preservation done with just a 3-person staff. So we do a lot of nonprofit partnership and a lot of grant writing, and we facilitate preservation that way and research that way. We don't have an advisory board that works with us on cemetery preservation. We don't have a historic district commission or historic preservation commission. We are kind of unique with respect to some other counties in that respect. But we do have amazing nonprofits like the Anne Arundel Genealogical Society that I'm going to keep bringing up over and over, like Tina Simmons. I love you. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of what we do. One of our so we have a cemetery inventory that we have that we're continuously updating. And it's part of our inventory of historic resources. It's in our definition in our county code that this is something that we maintain. In addition to historic buildings, archaeological sites, scenic and historic roads, et cetera. But we can't do that without using a geographic information system. So I'm looking at a bird's eye view almost every day, all the time, looking for those cemeteries, trying to map them out. And so we have the Spatial database that is our primary source of information for all of these cemeteries across the county. And it's got little snippets in there. Our county code established a hook for cemeteries in 2005, and that's when the Spatial database was begun. And it's got little comments in there that are derived from various sources that are not noted. I don't know where some of this information came from sometimes when I look at it, which can be a real big challenge when you're looking at a 3-mile radius of where a cemetery might be. But sometimes we do have information, but this Spatial database has gone through a few cleanups over the years. We've had consultants sit down and go through it, but it's still got, I think 50% of them are reported cemeteries that are somewhere in this area based on this historic source from 1902 or 1890, and it is a challenge. So the GIS is essential for us to keep those flags triggering a compliance review so we know that it's there. If we don't know a cemetery is there, we can't protect it. So we need to know it's there, and we need to know its boundaries. So the Spatial database, I know where some of it came from, and I would say that 95% of it came from the hard work of the Anne Arundel Genealogical Society, spearheaded by Tina Simmons. Again, I love you. Thank you so much for the work that you do. We get emails all the time from Tina saying, I found another one. She's always my go-to person, that and Dennis Green, of course, who's out there too. Thank you, Dennis, and other members of the Anne Arundel Genealogical Society. But these are our main sources. So we have historic maps and plats as well. If we see a cemetery is noted on a plat or a historic map, we're going to put it in our database. The Maryland Historical Trust has archaeological sites on occasion affiliated with cemeteries, but they aren't necessarily the first thing that people document, although it's getting better and better. People are starting to consider them more as needing to be put on the register as an archaeological site, even though the National Register for Significance doesn't acknowledge cemeteries' historic significance in any real way. So I'll talk about that a little bit, how we have that challenge of standardizing our inventory and getting that registry developed. But again, the Anne Arundel Genealogical Society really was the origin of this database of cemeteries, and they have an online search tool that you can use. So this is a great source of information for the public. It's connected to the Find a Grave, and so you can search for Anne Arundel cemeteries this way. We also, just in the past year, got up an online database available to the World Wide Web. Yay, you can actually look up your property by tax account number, by address, and see, or even resource name, and see if your property is flagged for a cemetery. So I encourage all of you, if you live in Anne Arundel County and know of a cemetery that's you're particularly fond of and want to make sure is taken care of, or any cemetery for that matter, check it out on this database. If it's not flagged, that means it's not in our database, and we need to get it in there. In terms of maps, we don't really have an online web map yet, although that's one of our objectives, but we do have one in the county office. So you can come to the office for your due diligence and go to the map room, and they will look up any potential historic resources that might be on your property. And so we have cemeteries flagged in terms of documented cemeteries where we know exactly where it is. We also have cemeteries that were moved that are flagged because, as you all know, a moved cemetery doesn't necessarily mean an entirely moved cemetery. So that's another research question that always pops up whenever those come in. And we also have those reported cemeteries. And you can see that some of these cover a pretty wide area, and that this is the blue for reported cemeteries. There are more of those on this map than there are of documented cemeteries. So our county legislation is in Article 17. It is triggered by development. So if you put in a grading permit, which means if you impact more than 5,000 square feet of land, I can see it. It will come to my office, and I have this code to tell me to use as a trigger, as a mechanism for to protect the cemetery. If you have a historic building you're going to demolish, same thing. If you want to subdivide, same thing. But you have to be impacting more than 5,000 feet of land. You have to be subdividing. You have to be putting in for a building permit that's demolishing. So as you can see, right there, we're missing a lot. So, but we have this since 2005, and this is a big, important tool for us for preservation. And the recent state legislation, thank you so much for what you've done with that, has answered some of my prayers. Please put it on a map. Just put it on a map, please, please, please. Thank you. Will help us so much. So first off, we have the first step. We need you to identify a cemetery. If there is a cemetery on your property, it has to be reported. That includes the location and the boundary of the cemetery. And this can be determined by using survey, archaeology, research, archival evidence, field observations, and also using modern map or plat evidence. If it's on a map, it helps us so much. So right here, I just wanted to point out, I have pictures to discuss these steps as we're looking at each plan that comes in for development. But these pictures are actually of the African American burial grounds at White Hall, and this was funded by the Trader Foundation, done in partnership with the Lost Towns Project. So the survey pictures here were actually done as a preservation outreach project from the Trader Foundation. So I thank them for that. That was an amazing, wonderful bit of information to actually document an unmarked cemetery in Anne Arundel County. So the Trader Foundation has already been making a big impact. But first, a survey using professional acceptable methods and techniques We definitely would prefer to have no disturbance to a cemetery. So GPR, ground penetrating radar, is great, but as you know, vegetation causes incredible challenges with that. Field observations, changes in vegetation, that can be amazing. Depressions, mapping those in. But generally, you end up needing to use all these facets to get a good boundary of a cemetery. And that's what they ended up having to do with Whitehall. Or rather, we ended up having to do with Whitehall. We had to map in where the vegetation was, where the depressions were, where the GPR anomalies were, just to get a good sense of the highest potential areas, high confidence, moderate confidence, and unmarked burials. So with this, we can at least get enough of a buffer around something. We might not be able to tell you exactly how many burials there are, exactly where the boundaries are, but we can at least tell you where not to go and give enough of a space to preserve that area. Sometimes we need to go a step further and do excavation, and you can actually do very minimal removal of the surface, about 6 inches, and see those burial shafts. So it may look invasive, and in some cases you may have to sacrifice some of the vegetation, but it can be imperative in a development situation to make sure you are not impacting those. So here we have a great picture, and I didn't get a chance to ask Tom, but thank you for letting me use this for educational purposes from one of his phase 1 reports. But they can, this picture doesn't show it up so clearly, but this is one of the means that we used in determining the location and boundary of a cemetery. We can also use plats. Sometimes they are great, like this one from, I think this was 1949 on the left, where they have clear boundaries. That solves so many problems. Modern parcels too, where they have the record, deed of record. Sometimes though, if you're going back in the 19th century, again, that's that bit of information that starts you back at that process again, where you have to find that location and boundary. It tells you it's there, so you need to do it. So this supports us justifying $10,000 for a survey. And we need that kind of evidence to justify it, because there's a lot of resistance to people doing a phase 1 survey for no means, for no reason, and to not find a cemetery. You know, you don't want them to spend that much money without due cause, so we have to have the argumentation for that. So once we have located the cemetery and figured out the boundary, our next step is preservation. And we are able to ask for a preservation easement with this code, which is an amazing thing, because that gets us to map the boundaries and put it on a map, and it's in the plat, and then you have it on record. And that's the amazing thing. You actually then know where the cemetery is. And we also require a 25-foot buffer to protect the cemetery, and a right-of-way of access so that family can go to the cemetery. The preservation easement, oh, and of course grading, construction, subsurface disturbance, that's basically what the easement says. You cannot do that within the boundaries of that area. It says you can maintain the cemetery as it exists, as it stands. So it's not really, it doesn't trigger restoration. It doesn't trigger someone coming out and pruning back the bushes so that access is easier necessarily. But it does get that bare minimum of maintenance to the property owner. And it's an interesting tension sometimes between preservation and restoration as well. So that's a conversation you need to have. And this easement gets us into that conversation too. If they want to do any kind of change to the cemetery, any restoration, we can advise on what best practice is. So this gets it on the map. We get it on our plats. We identify it as having a cemetery preservation easement, and we get a plat note that identifies the deed of record for that easement, because it's then recorded in the Anne Arundel County land records. So that's what we've got to work with, which is an amazing, wonderful thing. But as I mentioned, we do have those loopholes, and we also have some things in our code that do bring up other challenges. With our database, our mapping database, we're trying to identify all areas where there may be a cemetery, but if you have that undocumented cemetery that's, you know, within a 3-mile radius, it's flagged as a cemetery, but that's that's a real trigger word for people. Archaeological potential, not so much, but if you say there's a cemetery possibly on your property, it starts the conversation in a way immediately that, we've been talking about this. Is this really the best way to approach that problem? If you have a family cemetery possibly in a 3-mile radius, you possibly have a historic farmstead. So maybe we should be identifying these instead of this possible cemetery as maybe an area of archaeological potential, because the cemetery identification would be a part of that phase 1 survey anyways. So this is one of the conversations we're having, because we don't want to bring panic to people immediately. And yeah, because they might not have that cemetery on their property. And so that is a challenge. Also, the lack of the standardized inventory. Every single cemetery that comes in, I feel like I have to start over, at the beginning. I go to Tina Simmons' great work. I email her. I talk to Dennis Green. I talk to the Genealogical Society. I talk to the neighbors. And then I try to see what we have in our archives. And we don't actually have that much for each of these cemeteries in our archives. And we don't have a standardized form. We do not have a condition assessment yet. So we're still in baby steps. We have this code from 2005, and we have an inventory, but it is in very fledgling stages. And that's one of the reasons I went to the Montgomery County Cemetery inventory thing, because I think it's such a great initiative, and it's something that we should be doing statewide. And the Coalition for Maryland Burial Grounds and Preservation Maryland has been doing great work, and it has been revving up interest in the challenges that we're all facing with these cemeteries. And it has definitely increased this conversation level at our county too, which is great. So, but I'll end with that. One of the things in our code that is kind of a sticking point for us, or a sticking point, preservation in place. We don't allow movement of a cemetery in our code, except under conditions where they had a permit in 1999 where they were allowed to move part of the cemetery. Then we might allow them to move the rest of it. But generally, our recommendation is preservation in place, which is based on the county code. And that's not always the best thing for the cemetery, even with the best intentions. Like this one cemetery that's located out in a field, it was actually a great idea. They're going to preserve the cemetery, leave it in place. They were going to level out the field by putting more land on top of it. And they took GPS coordinates of where each marker was, and they removed those markers with careful cataloging, and they put them in storage. And the idea was they're going to put that land on top, they're going to landscape, they're going to put a fence around it, and they're going to bring the markers back. But it's been caught in limbo as a result of that, because as you know, development plans are just plans. They haven't been executed yet. And so we have this cemetery that was in that preservation in place mode, and it was a creative solution with best intentions, but the descendants really want their descendants' place of repose to be recognized. And right now, it's not really recognized. People don't know it's out there. But one of our challenges is security. If we do put things back there, this is out in a field, and they've developed it up. You've got a big shopping mall now over there. So if you start to highlight that there's a cemetery floating out in a field where no one's living around it, it encourages vandalism. So you have that tension where you don't want to encourage that. So this one's been in constant talks, and again, community involvement is essential with this one, and I think we're at a turning point with this. So, but that's one of those challenges that we deal with. And the preservation in place is not always ideal. We've seen some legacy projects from back in the day that are a little strange, like a cemetery located, an 18th century plantation with a family cemetery that was identified located in the middle of a Home Depot parking lot. And no one knows it's there. They're walking along, it's in the median. That is not an ideal situation. But again, it was that preservation in place. So it's, and we also have that challenge of protecting historic cemeteries, even on county property. So this one was very upsetting. We had a 150-year-old gravestone stolen from Linthicum Walks recently. And this resulted in installing a security camera. And I mean, who steals a gravestone? But apparently it does happen. And this is one of our older family cemeteries in the county. And it was a footstone. So fortunately, we still have the headstones there. And it's well documented, so we have the information. But still, it's that tension of trying to find the ideal preservation standard for each of these. And I've kind of discussed this already, but the lack of the standardized inventory, having to start at the beginning, not having a document, like a form where it's just checked off, like, is this information valid? Do we have a source for this? Do we have a condition? Is this something we would require a survey for in this area? This is something we really, really need to do. And the John McCubbin grave, I love Helen Ridgely's document. You know, she brings in so much information, and it's that frustration, like, it's almost there. We almost know where it is. We know it was there, but where? So again, just bringing up the geocortex challenge and how to, inform the public on this in a way that brings a healthy conversation without, immediately having people run in panic. We also have a real challenge with unmarked cemeteries, and this is where our county code is not really, we don't have any mechanisms for unmarked and unclaimed cemeteries. This is a cemetery that keeps coming up, and we are kind of at a loss. The property owner bought this set of 3 lots. He understood that he bought the 3 lots. His tax account records indicate he only owns 2 of the lots. The 1920 plat indicates that this lot was identified as, not having ownership. And if you go back in the deeds to 1917, the chain of title breaks. It identifies a half-acre cemetery that was set aside outside of the whole division of this property. So we are kind of met with this challenge where he didn't know there was a cemetery back there, and he started to remove the vegetation, and he was in violation for removing vegetation in a critical area, but it's underneath the scope for grading violation. He doesn't own the property that's adjacent, so there's really no one to sue for the impact on the cemetery through the county code. The county code doesn't have any vehicles or funding for resurvey. The county is not going to take on unclaimed property. So this is our challenge, and this is where community outreach is essential. This is where the community is needed to step up, and I know Tina Simmons and Dennis Green have been doing amazing things already with this. So there is, I guess, a process at the state level through the real property law where you can claim unclaimed property through the descendants, if you can find a descendant, to this area. So this is a work in progress, but right now the county doesn't have any mechanism really to stop this guy from parking here. This is at a state level at this point. The state law can be kicked in, but we can't do anything. The county also doesn't have any money to remove vegetation. They don't have the money to bring a dump truck over. This is, again, on the onus of the property owners or the community. So we don't have enough carrots and sticks in our code, and this is one of the things we keep talking about. However, cemeteries are on everyone's radar right now. This is when it's time to strike, because the iron is hot, and we just got in our budget that we're going to be revisiting this intently, going through our county historic cemetery inventory. I know the State Highway Administration is also intently on board to update their cemetery inventory within state highway right-of-ways, and they're collaborating with counties across the state. And so we have this in our proposed budget as a key objective for this next year, to review and develop a management plan for the county's historic cemetery inventory, to include developing a standardized inventory form, to consolidate, verify, and field check on over 600 cemeteries currently on file, and produce a citizen's guide to the historic cemeteries of Anne Arundel County. And I just got an email yesterday where the Four Rivers Heritage Area is implementing a working group in Anne Arundel County on cemeteries. So a lot of exciting things are happening, and I think that a lot of people in this room are responsible for that, so I thank you. So you have a handout. If you know of any cemeteries in Anne Arundel County that are not in our database, please let me know. Thank you.